People travel across the world to see this staircase, but what if I told you it was fake? That's right, I'm just very good at mime work. Or maybe the staircase itself isn't fake, but the story behind it has definitely been exaggerated. Because when you have an old house that's falling apart and you want to sell it as a tourist destination to fund your nonprofit, you might want to add some architectural interest and intrigue. So you tell a few small fibs and get a creative architect who can help turn a really old house that had been renovated to look like all of its neighbors and turn it back to look like some version of that really old house, which then becomes the old-looking Salem house, which then inspires everything under the sun or the moon, like the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina or countless Sims builds. As someone who constantly wants to tell people about old things but is fighting against the understandable human urge to not be interested in things that smell musty, I can see why you might get imaginative. New England in 1900 was kind of facing the reality of being called New England, but not really being that new anymore. And just like a person noticing fine lines might want to experiment with Botox, in architecture you can turn back the clock by doing a restoration. Taking a building back to its former glory, or at least attempting to, by adjusting the roof, removing the siding, taking out all modern conveniences. Former glory is relative, since most of these buildings have become more comfortable and usable as time progressed. I personally love the aesthetic of walking around with a candle and a nightgown as much as the next Scrooge, but technically speaking, I am happy to live in a home with lights and electricity and hot water. Spoiled. As New England and Salem were getting older, there was an urge to commemorate all the things you did when you were little, like a witch hunt. Now, to explain how the House of the Seven Gables went from this to this, I have to talk about a book. I know, I'm sorry. From the brain that brought you ECA, The Scarlet Letter, came The House of the Seven Gables, a book with names I am certain you will see in the 2025 baby names list. Hepzibah, Holgrave, Clifford. Almost everyone's last name is Pynchon, and to be honest, I was pinching myself to stay awake on this one. It was written by Nathaniel Hawthorne after his instant bestseller, The Scarlet Letter, about a single woman with a baby and a lot of guilt, proving her godliness in Puritan culture. The House of the Seven Gables was another instant success, and equally cheerful about an elderly woman burdened with her family's financial and legal troubles. But he had written this one a little closer to home, inspired by this house when he visited his older cousin Susanna. And it looked like this when he saw it. She lived in the house as the only living descendant of her family. Now, Hawthorne didn't directly show this family's story, but he created a more dramatic, more mystical version. The reason the fictional Pynchon family was cursed was because they had stolen the land from a man they accused of being a wizard. The curse began soon after the home was built, when the owner was found dead. The curse that killed the real family was mostly yellow fever after being engaged in the slave trade in the West Indies. And the land wasn't stolen from a wizard, it was taken from the Namkyog people. But in the book, the home being on the stolen land of a wizard added a historical connection to the witch trials that had happened 150 years before. And it turns out Hawthorne is a bit of a Salem witch trial nepo baby. I feel underdressed to talk about the witch trials. Let me put on my witch hat. Much better. Honestly, it's making my eyes look really... I'm not gonna keep wearing this, but let's all just laugh with the joke. It's a witch hat. So if you're wondering why I have footage of myself walking up the stairs of the House of the Seven Gables, that's because I recorded podcast episodes at the House of the Seven Gables and the Rebecca Nurse Homestead. And despite going to Salem State for college and spending a lot of time in the city, I did not have a very good perspective on the Salem Witch Trials because everything I read was about the accusers, not the accused. And when I'm downtown, I was normally noticing like the bronze bewitched statue, which has very little connection to the actual Salem Witch Trials. But once I learned more about Rebecca Nurse by going to her house, I had a more complete view of the Salem Witch Trials. The biggest thing I learned from looking at the accused or the victims of the Salem Witch Trials was realizing who the first three women accused were. The first woman was Tituba. She was a black enslaved woman married to a Native American man, and she was accused by her enslaver's daughter and niece. The second woman was homeless and was known to curse under her breath, and not like a witch curse, like literally just swearing. The third woman was widowed and remarried a man below her class. He had been an indentured servant. She was also ill and bedridden and hadn't been to church in years. When you look at that first group, it feels less like magical sorcery and more like going after outsiders in your community. A lot of historians see Rebecca Nurse and her sisters as kind of a turning point in the Salem Witch Trials, because these three sisters had supportive families and were generally well liked by their community. Kids are walking by outside and they're talking about what they're going to be for Halloween, and a little girl just said, "I'm going to be a witch." Perfect timing. Just 39 community members put their lives on the line by signing a petition supporting Rebecca Nurse. All three sisters were accused, but only the youngest sister survived. Possibly because her sister, Mary Easty, wrote a letter to the governor. I'm going to read it now. "Knowing my own innocency and seeing plainly the wiles and subtlety of my accusers, I cannot but judge charitably of others that are going the same way of myself. If the Lord steps not mightily in, I petition not for my own life, for I know I must die, but that, if it be possible, no more innocent blood may be shed." If you're wondering what happened to that first group of accused, Tituba delayed her trial by becoming an expert witness. By the time her trial occurred, the Salem Witch Trials were over and it was seen as like a mark of embarrassment. The jury refused to charge her. But she needed her jail fees paid, and her enslaver, Samuel Parrish, refused to do so. She was released to another person, and no further historical record exists of her. Sarah Good, the woman who was homeless, was hung. Beyond spectral evidence, another piece of evidence used against her was that Samuel Parrish had given her money, and also, yes, this is the same Samuel Parrish who enslaved Tituba. He had given her money at the parsonage, and instead of thanking him, she just muttered under her breath, "Doesn't really feel like evidence at all." Quick sidebar to explain spectral evidence. It was evidence through testimony based on visions or dreams and the actions of the witches, spirits, or specters within those visions. So Sarah Good in real life had just been generally unpleasant in town, but on an invisible spectral plane, Sarah Good had been pinching Ann Putnam and asking her to sign a book. When spectral evidence was no longer allowed, the trials stopped. And Sarah Osborne, the woman who was widowed and remarried, she died after 9 weeks in a Boston prison. And she was the first to die in the Salem Witch Trials. And it was really all stacked against them, and there was a big assumption of guilt, which you hear about in this quote from A Storm of Witchcraft by Emerson Baker. Even before the questioning began of Sarah Good, Tituba, and Sarah Osborne, Hathorne and Corwin had assumed their guilt. Rather than weighing the evidence behind the charges, they became interrogators, focusing on determining how the witches operated, identifying their circles of co-conspirators, and finding out why they chose their particular victims. And you might be asking, Judge Hathorne? That sure sounds close to Hawthorne. And yes, Nathaniel Hawthorne is a direct descendant of the man who sentenced many of these women to their death. And for Nathaniel Hawthorne, in writing The House of the Seven Gables, he was just tying his connection closer. Back to Rebecca Nurse and her house. She lived in this house until she was taken from it and brought to prison, and she never returned to the home alive. Descendants of hers continued to be the owners of the house until 1905, when it was purchased by Rebecca Nurse Memorial Association, who had it restored to some version of its historic past. And despite this being a house that people lived in until 1905, things changed when it met Joseph Chandler. Or maybe he went by Joey Chandler with his friends? Joseph Everett Chandler was an architect who loved a colonial. When he wasn't building a Colonial Revival library that looked like this or this, he was restoring the Paul Revere house, or the Rebecca Nurse house, or the House of the Seven Gables. There's something kind of strange about taking a house that probably had nice plaster walls, some form of lighting, heating, and ripping it all out. Rebecca Nurse's relatives had been living in and updating a house over the centuries, but the house was semi-returned to 1636, despite being built in 1678, and being most historically relevant when Rebecca Nurse was taken from it in 1692. And that early 1900s interest in the past explains why there was such an interest in this old-timey architecture. I have read a lot of quotes from architects of that era, kind of talking crap about Victorian style, and speaking on how wonderful colonial architecture was. And a lot of it stems from this interest in the nation's history. There was a desire to preserve the Founding Fathers' homes and spaces, and then emulate them in their current builds. Coming out of the Victorian era, there was this shift to Colonial Revival. And despite Victorians feeling so old to us now, At the time, it was modern in a lot of ways and was at the cutting edge of building capabilities. They would be critiqued being called cheap because they had elements that were mass-produced. And the Victorian era connected to a time of a lot of growth in the United States. The abolition of slavery, Reconstruction, industrialization, westward expansion. But like a pendulum, Victorian houses went out of style. After these interesting shapes and towers, there was interest in the simple, kind of boxy, Colonial Revival. Consistently in my reading, people describe the value of the colonial, referring to the nation's simpler time. One of the biggest places that was used as inspiration for these new buildings, especially in the Northeast, was Mount Vernon, the Virginia home of George Washington, which was a full plantation with 317 enslaved people at the time of George Washington's death. So simple might not be the best word for it, unless you intentionally cut out all the complicated parts. So with his interest in colonials, Chandler found himself working on the House of the Seven Gables at the same time as the Rebecca Nurse house. But the bigger House of the Seven Gables took 2 years, because it also had bigger ambitions, courtesy of Caroline Emmerton. She bought the House of the Seven Gables with a plan in mind. She was going to create a settlement house in Salem. This was an effort started by women nationwide to provide social services to immigrants new to the cities. In 1889, in Chicago, the most prominent settlement house was created by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. Hull House provided kindergarten, a nursery, public baths, space for union meetings, as well as classes. When the mansion that was based on the best-selling book was for sale, Caroline Emmerton saw an opportunity. Create the House of the Seven Gables as a destination to experience the book, then use that revenue from ticket sales to fund the settlement house. Caroline Emmerton and Joseph Chandler came together to make this house look like it's from 1668 on the outside and the early 1700s on the inside, based on when Nathaniel Hawthorne set the book. They returned the second floor overhang and replaced the newer siding and added back many of the gables that had gotten lost along the way. But they also added pieces that helped the house connect with the book. The little shop that Hephzibah ran was recreated, and a staircase was added in a chimney to explain the path needed to quickly do a murder. And despite knowing it was not in the original house, and years of false claims that it was, I was giddy squeezing through this staircase. I've been to my fair share of historic house museums, and doing something active and mysterious is exciting. But when you start mixing actually old things with fiction, you get this kind of funny setup, where the lines blur on what's old and what's new, and what's fact and what's fiction. In Moby Dick, there is a chapel that a bunch of sailors go to. It was based on a real chapel that Herman Melville visited, but when he was writing about it, he added a little bit of spice. Instead of the minister being on a slightly raised, he added a bow of the boat as the pulpit, floating from the wall that required a ladder to climb up. It made the scene feel more cinematic and memorable. And then 110 years after the book's publication, the boat was added to the real chapel that it was based on that never had a boat. It happens with movies and TV too. It's how the Brady Bunch house got its interior recreated on HGTV, just for the superfan owner to say it was a terrible investment. Or you have the Star Wars theme park in Disney World, where you can go to Batuu and eat fried Endorian tip-yip, or Harry Potter World, or an Airbnb of Shrek's house. I think when these fictional places capture so much space in our minds, we want to make that dream a reality. We want to have these places take up real space around us. It explains the line around the block for the Friends experience. Did you see Joey Chandler there? Restoring actual history and creating brand new fictional places don't have the same pitfalls. Especially these modern examples, there is footage of these places. We know every square foot of them. Except for the place that the camera is, of course. But these restoration architects don't have that limitless information. First, they're trying to capture reality, but they also have to base it off of a million pieces of tiny little data. What type of nails were there? How was the wood cut? What type of stone was used? All those tiny details, and you'll never be right. There is no photo, there is no sketch. Nothing is untouched by time. Because preserving things is messy. It assumes you finish something in the same time period that you started it, which has not been the case for my 3-year scarf project. And it also assumes that anything is ever truly finished. And looking back 100 years at the work of Caroline Emmerton and what she created, that staircase has become historical. It's in a million people's memories, it's in photos, it's in books. And when you look at the wider story of the house, their contributions are in it. A house that was built, changed, fictionalized, and then fiction and the house met in reality. And it adds this whole additional layer to the house's history. And even when you try as hard as you can to keep everything as it was, changes happen, and that's okay, because now you're part of the history too. Now I'm gonna go and try and finish knitting this scarf so it can be from like circa 2023. I forget how. I also wanted to very sincerely say thank you all for all your support on the last video. I have been wanting this to potentially be my job for a long time, and that feels like more like a possibility than ever. I will be going back to AD. I have some other ideas for some stuff that's more modern focused. If you like this video, you're cool. And you might also like this video I did on the best witch houses in movies and TV. That was like one of my earliest videos on this channel, so pardon me not using a face cam and also it not being particularly good. I appreciate you all so much. Okay, bye everyone. Thank you. Bye.